He looked like the kind of man the world admires. A self-made billionaire, a financial genius, a philanthropist, a sport patron, a kingmaker in the Caribbean. He flew in private jets, hosted royalty and politicians, funded international cricket, owned mansions, yachts, helicopters, and walked through life like a man who could buy anything. His name was Alan Stanford. To the public, he was a global banking titan. To the rich, he was exclusive. To investors, he was safe. To governments, he was powerful. But behind the luxury, behind the prestige, behind the carefully polished image of old money elegance, was one of the biggest financial frauds in American history. A sprawling empire built on lies. An empire that promised safety, but fed on trust. For years, retirees, teachers, small business owners, doctors, widows, people who had spent their entire lives saving money, handed over their futures to Alan Stanford. They believed they were buying security. Instead, they were financing the fantasy of a fraud. By the time the truth came crashing down, more than $7 billion had vanished into a black hole of deception. And the man at the center of it all? He wasn't a brilliant banker. He was something much darker. A salesman of illusion, a manipulator of power, a counterfeit billionaire who built a private kingdom out of other people's life savings. This is the story of Alan Stanford and the fake billionaire bank empire that fooled the world. Before we begin, if you're fascinated by true crime stories where power hides something monstrous, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications because this story proves that sometimes the most dangerous criminals don't wear masks. They wear tailored suits. To understand how Alan Stanford pulled off one of the most devastating financial scams in modern history, you have to understand the image he spent decades creating. Robert Alan Stanford was born on March 24th, 1950, in Mexia, Texas. On the surface, his background seemed respectable. His family had business roots in Texas, and like many men who would later reinvent themselves as moguls, Stanford learned early that in America, perception can be as valuable as cash. He attended Baylor University, though not in the way the public later imagined. He did not become some legendary Wall Street prodigy. He was not a financial mastermind shaped by elite institutions. But Alan Stanford had something else, something often far more dangerous than intelligence alone. He had ambition, he had ego, and he had a talent for making people believe he was bigger than he really was. In the 1970s, he began in business connected to the family venture world, real estate, finance, and speculative activity. Nothing yet suggested the scale of what was coming. But early on, there were warning signs. He gravitated toward opaque deals, complex structures, loose oversight, jurisdictions where rules could bend, and most importantly, places where money could move faster than scrutiny. Alan Stanford did not build his future in the heart of transparent American banking. He built it in the shadows between countries, between regulations, between questions. And as the years passed, he became obsessed with a single idea, not just becoming rich, but looking rich. Because for Alan Stanford, wealth was never just about money. It was about theater. It was about control. It was about walking into a room and making everyone else feel smaller. Many fraudsters want cash. Alan Stanford wanted status. He wanted to be seen as untouchable. He wanted governments to court him. He wanted celebrities to stand beside him. He wanted powerful people to need him. He wanted his name attached to exclusivity, sophistication, and success. And that hunger would become the fuel for a criminal empire. By the 1980s and 1990s, Alan Stanford was no longer just a businessman. He was becoming a brand. And that brand was built around a seductive promise. Offshore banking with elite safety. To many investors, offshore finance sounded glamorous. Private, international, sophisticated. For the wealthy, it implied access to something ordinary people didn't understand. For retirees, it sounded stable, especially when sold by the right person. And Alan Stanford knew exactly how to sell it. His empire grew around Stanford Financial Group, a network of companies and institutions that included brokerage operations in the United States and, most crucially, Stanford International Bank, based in Antigua. Now, this is where the real danger began, because Antigua gave Alan Stanford something priceless. A jurisdiction where oversight was far weaker than what he would have faced in the United States. A place where regulation could be influenced. A place where proximity to power could matter more than independent enforcement. And Alan Stanford moved aggressively to make himself indispensable there. He didn't just open a bank. He embedded himself into the social and political fabric of the island. He cultivated relationships. He donated money. He projected prosperity. He made himself appear like a benefactor. The kind of man who brings jobs, tourism, prestige, and international attention. To some, he looked like a visionary investor. To others, he looked like a golden goose. But behind the scenes, Stanford International Bank was being positioned as something even more powerful. A vault of trust. Visuals. Brochures with polished financial language. Handshakes in conference rooms. Elderly couples reviewing statements. Bank seals and safety imagery. The flagship product that would eventually anchor the fraud was deceptively simple. Certificates of deposit. CDs. One of the most boring, conservative-sounding financial products imaginable. And that was exactly why they worked. Because CDs aren't supposed to feel dangerous. They feel safe, predictable, stable. The kind of thing retirees buy. The kind of thing people choose when they do not want risk. Alan Stanford's brokers pitched these offshore CDs as secure, expertly managed, globally diversified investments, often with consistently attractive returns that beat many mainstream banks, but not so outrageously high that they instantly triggered suspicion. That was the genius of the lie. He didn't promise impossible riches. He promised slightly better safety. And for many victims, that was irresistible. A scam this large doesn't survive on one man alone. It needs an ecosystem, a machine. And Alan Stanford built one. His U.S.-based brokerage arm employed financial advisors who presented themselves as trusted professionals. Many clients met them in respectable offices. They were not meeting a man in a dark alley. They were meeting licensed advisors in clean suits, in polished buildings, under the umbrella of a brand that looked elite and stable. That's what made this fraud so devastating. It didn't feel like a scam. It felt like private banking. Stanford brokers marketed the CDs as the crown jewel of the Stanford empire. They spoke of international diversification, careful asset management, sophisticated strategies, conservative stewardship. Clients were told that the bank's portfolio was highly liquid, closely managed, and supported by strong reserves. In reality, much of what they were being told was false. According to later investigators, Stanford International Bank's investment portfolio was misrepresented to clients on a massive scale. Statements and sales materials suggested a carefully constructed, diversified, professionally managed set of assets. But regulators would later allege that the real picture was far murkier and far more dangerous. Some money was funneled into illiquid private investments, some into real estate, some into speculative holdings, some into personal loans and insider arrangements. And enormous amounts were simply used to sustain the illusion. That is the key to understanding a Ponzi-style structure. It does not need to generate real profits if enough new money keeps coming in. New deposits can pay old obligations. Paper statements can create confidence. Confidence brings more deposits, and the cycle repeats. It becomes less a bank and more stage set, with every investor unknowingly playing a role. Alan Stanford understood something many white-collar criminals understand better than most. People don't just invest in numbers. They invest in identity. If the man in charge looks rich enough, powerful enough, connected enough, then people stop asking the right questions. And Alan Stanford looked exactly like what victims expected a billionaire banker to look like. He traveled by private jet. He owned yachts. He bought mansions. He surrounded himself with luxury. He cultivated media coverage. He was photographed with public figures. He built an aura of exclusivity around himself. To clients, he wasn't just a financial executive. He was proof. Look at how successful he is, people thought. No one living like this could be faking it. But that is often how the lie works. The fraud pays for the costume, and the costume becomes evidence of legitimacy. It is one of the most psychologically effective tricks in financial crime, because victims see wealth and assume it was earned. Instead, in many cases, it was financed by them. Investigators would later allege that investor funds supported a lifestyle of astonishing extravagance. Lavish real estate, private aircraft, expensive travel, sponsorship deals, political influence, personal excess, even loans and benefits to insiders. And perhaps nowhere was this image building more public than in cricket. Alan Stanford poured huge amounts of money into Caribbean cricket. To outsiders, it looked like philanthropy. A rich man uplifting a beloved sport. A patron bringing global attention and prize money. He sponsored tournaments. He created spectacle. He attached his name to athletic prestige. And for the Caribbean, where cricket carries deep cultural meaning, this wasn't just sports branding. It was social influence. It made him visible, beloved in some circles, celebrated, respected, and most importantly, it made criticism harder. Because how do you accuse the man who funds dreams? How do you challenge the benefactor? How do you question the billionaire everyone is busy thanking? That was Alan Stanford's genius. He didn't just buy luxury. He bought narrative. So what exactly were the crimes? What was Alan Stanford actually doing? To answer that, we need to strip away the luxury and look at the mechanics. At the center of the case was the allegation that Stanford International Bank sold billions of dollars in CDs based on false representations. Clients were told the bank held a carefully managed, diversified portfolio. But investigators later said those representations were deceptive. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, known as the SEC, alleged that the bank's assets were not what investors were led to believe. Instead of a conservative, liquid, highly monitored portfolio, there were risky and often illiquid investments, undisclosed related party transactions, a lack of reliable, independent oversight, and internal control failures that should have terrified any legitimate investor. In simple terms, people thought their money was in a secure vault, but the vault was largely an illusion. And then came one of the most important elements of the alleged fraud: falsified performance and concealment. The bank reported improbably smooth returns. Year after year, it projected consistency. That kind of consistency is catnip to cautious investors. Markets rise and fall. Crises happen. Volatilité, chaque institution. But Stanford's story was always reassuring. Always polished. Always controlled. That should have been a red flag. Because real markets are messy. Fraud looks smooth. Investigators also allege that Stanford and insiders manipulated information about the bank's investment committee and oversight practices. Clients were led to believe professionals were independently protecting their funds. But prosecutors later argued that Alan Stanford himself exercised dominating control. The supposed checks and balances were weak. In some cases, cosmetic. In others, misleading. There were also allegations involving mail fraud, guide fraude, conspiracy, obstruction, document-related deception, and a pattern of using cross-border structures to frustrate transparency. The complexity was not accidental. Complexity is a weapon in financial crime. The more layers you add, the more jurisdictions you use, the more shell structures you create, the harder it becomes for ordinary investors to understand where their money actually is. And when people don't understand, they trust. And when they trust, the fraud grows. Like many giant frauds, Alan Stanford's empire did not collapse because no one had doubts. It survived because doubts were not acted on fast enough. There had been concerns, questions, skepticism, people inside and outside the system who noticed things that didn't add up. And one of the most haunting parts of this story is that it unfolded in an era already scarred by major financial deception. This was not a world innocent to fraud. By the 2000s, financial regulators had seen enough scandals to know that smooth returns, opaque offshore structures, and personality-driven empires should trigger alarm. And yet, Alan Stanford kept going. Why? Because fraudsters like Stanford exploit more than greed. They exploit institutional hesitation, cross-border complexity, jurisdictional friction, political influence, and the natural human fear of accusing a powerful man without an airtight case. By the time regulators began moving more aggressively, the empire had already consumed years of trust and billions in deposits. Then came 2008, the global financial crisis, and suddenly, the world became a much more dangerous place for financial illusionists. When markets convulse, liquidity matters. Transparency matters. Red flags that once looked manageable begin to look deadly. And the environment that had allowed Stanford to appear stable became the very environment that exposed him. In February 2009, the illusion finally began to shatter. The SEC filed a sweeping civil fraud action against Alan Stanford and key associates. The allegation was staggering. A massive fraud centered around approximately $7 billion in certificates of deposit. For investors, the news was surreal. How could a bank that looked this powerful, this polished, this global, be a lie? But once regulators moved in, the empire began to crack at terrifying speed. Receivers were appointed. Operations were frozen. Assets were scrutinized. And panic spread among clients desperate to know one thing. Where's our money? For many, there was no immediate answer. Because the problem with a fake empire is this. The buildings may be real. The jets may be real. The parties may be real. But the security people believed in never existed. And then, the stories began to emerge. Retirees who had entrusted life savings. Families who believed they had chosen the safe option. Small business owners who parked cash reserves. People who were told this was the conservative move. People who were not gambling. People who were trying to protect themselves. And now they were staring into financial ruin. That is what separates white-collar crime from its image. It may not leave blood on the floor, but it leaves devastation all the same. Homes sold. Retirements destroyed. Medical futures jeopardized. Trust shattered, and in some cases, lives permanently altered. Alan Stanford's fall was dramatic. The man who once moved like royalty was suddenly under intense federal scrutiny. He was eventually charged criminally, and the case against him painted a damning picture. Not a misunderstood financier, but a deliberate architect of deception. In the months after the civil case exploded, there were bizarre twists. At one point, Stanford was reportedly assaulted while in custody by another inmate. Later, questions also emerged about his use of prescription anti-anxiety medication and whether it affected his mental state and legal competence. For a while, the path to trial became tangled with competency issues, delays, and procedural battles. But the larger truth never changed. The empire was dead, and the myth of Alan Stanford, the genius billionaire banker, was disintegrating in public. His titles could no longer protect him. His influence could no longer shield him. His glamour could no longer distract from the question at the center of everything. Did he knowingly build a financial machine that fed on lies? Federal prosecutors believed the answer was yes, and they were preparing to prove it. Alan Stanford's criminal trial became one of the most closely watched white-collar prosecutions of its era. By then, the world had already witnessed the collapse of another infamous fraudster, Bernie Madoff, and comparisons were inevitable. Two men, two empires, two carefully curated images of financial mastery, two catastrophes built on trust. But Alan Stanford's case had its own distinct shape. It was more international, more flamboyant, more politically entangled, and in some ways, more psychologically complex. Because unlike a pure back-office operator, Stanford had turned himself into a public spectacle. He had sold not just returns, but lifestyle, status, prestige, access. At trial, prosecutors argued that Stanford and his associates lied about the bank's financial health, lied about how client funds were invested, and used investor money to sustain both operations and personal extravagance. They presented evidence intended to show that the supposedly safe CD portfolio was built on falsehoods and concealment. Defense arguments attempted to challenge the government's narrative, as often happens in complex financial cases. But prosecutors focused on something juries understand deeply. If you tell people their money is safe when you know it isn't, if you disguise risk as security, if you fabricate the image of disciplined stewardship while secretly controlling the system for your own benefit, that is not aggressive business. That is fraud. And the jury listened. In March 2012, Alan Stanford was convicted on multiple criminal counts. The verdict was devastating. He was found guilty of orchestrating a sprawling investment fraud. The once celebrated billionaire banker had officially been redefined by the law. A criminal, not a mogul, not a visionary, a fraudster. Later that year, in June 2012, Alan Stanford was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. A symbolic sentence, yes, but also a statement, a declaration that the scale of the damage, the years of deception, the breadth of human loss, could not be dismissed as mere financial misjudgment. This was not a business failure. It was a betrayal on a massive scale. One of the most painful questions in any fraud case is the simplest one. Can victims ever get their money back? In Alan Stanford's case, that process became long, complicated, and deeply imperfect. Receivers and court-appointed teams worked for years to identify, seize, liquidate, and distribute assets tied to the Stanford empire. That meant chasing down real estate, bank accounts, investment holdings, luxury items, business interests, cross-border assets, and money that had moved through a maze of entities and jurisdictions. But recovering money from a collapsed fraud is never like opening a vault. By the time authorities arrive, much of the money is gone, spent, moved, recycled, buried in failed ventures, hidden in illiquid assets, or simply vaporized through years of sustaining the lie. Some recoveries were made over time, but for many victims, full recovery was impossible. And that's the cruel arithmetic of fraud. Even when the criminal loses everything, the victims rarely get made whole. It is easy to talk about billions, but billions are abstract. What matters is what those billions represented. For one victim, it meant retirement. For another, it meant a child's education. For another, it meant medical security. For another, it meant the last safe years of life after decades of work. Many victims were not thrill seekers. They were conservative savers. People who believed they were making prudent choices. People who trusted advisors. People who saw the Stanford name and assumed sophistication meant safety. Some had concentrated huge portions of their wealth in the CDs. Others were reassured again and again that the investment was secure. That's why the emotional damage ran so deep. Because the loss wasn't just financial. It was psychological, humiliating, shattering. Some victims blamed themselves. Others became consumed by anger. Some spent years in legal limbo. Some lost relationships under the strain. Some lost peace of mind they never fully recovered. White-collar crime rarely gets the same visceral reaction as violent crime. But if you zoom in on the victims, you begin to understand something chilling. This kind of crime steals time. And for older victims especially, time is the one thing no court can return. So how did Alan Stanford fool so many people for so long? The answer is uncomfortable, because it wasn't just one trick. It was a combination of highly effective psychological weapons. 1. He sold safety, not greed. This is critical. Many scams promise outrageous returns. Stanford often sold something subtler. Steady, superior safety. That appeals to cautious people. It lowers suspicion. 2. He used offshore mystique. To many clients, offshore sounded sophisticated, international elite. In reality, it also meant reduced transparency and weaker practical oversight. 3. He built visible wealth. Jets, yachts, mansions, events. People assumed his lifestyle proved legitimacy. In truth, that lifestyle helped manufacture trust. 4. He embedded himself politically and socially. Influence can delay scrutiny. Relationships can soften suspicion. Prestige can silence doubt. 5. He used licensed professionals and respectable offices. Victims weren't wiring money to a random stranger. They were sitting across from advisors in professional environments. That matters. 6. He exploited complexity. Most people do not understand cross-border banking structures. Even many smart investors can be overwhelmed by layered financial jargon, and confusion is fertile ground for deception. 7. He projected certainty. Confidence is intoxicating. Fraudsters who never appear uncertain can be extraordinarily persuasive. Alan Stanford didn't look nervous. He looked inevitable, and that made people trust him. Whenever Alan Stanford's case is discussed, one comparison always emerges: Bernie Madoff. And while the two cases are different in structure, they share chilling similarities. Both men built reputations that made skepticism feel socially awkward. Both relied on trust. Both benefited from the idea that elite access equals elite safety. Both projected consistency in a world where consistency should have trigger questions. And both left behind enormous wreckage. But Stanford's fraud had a particularly theatrical dimension. Madoff often projected understated Wall Street credibility. Stanford projected imperial luxury. He didn't just want to be trusted. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be envied. He wanted to look like a man who had conquered the world. And perhaps that made the illusion even more seductive. Because for many victims, investing with Stanford wasn't just a financial decision. It felt like entry into a higher class of safety. A private club, a smarter tier of banking. But the club was fake, and the doorman was a thief. Alan Stanford's story is not just about one man. It is about a dangerous truth. Some of the most devastating criminals in history never look criminal. They look polished, educated, successful, philanthropic. They sponsor sports. They shake hands with politicians. They donate to communities. They smile for cameras. They create the illusion of abundance, so convincing that questioning them feels rude. But fraud on this scale is never just about money. It is about domination, about making people hand over trust, about turning confidence into currency, about building a kingdom where appearance replaces truth. Alan Stanford wanted the world to see a billionaire empire. And for years, it did. What it didn't see was that the empire was being held together by paper promises, misdirection, and the life savings of ordinary people. That is what makes this story so haunting. Because the victims were not chasing fantasy. They were chasing security. And that security was sold to them by a man who had mastered one terrifying skill. He made lies look luxurious. Alan Stanford built a private empire out of borrowed trust. He dressed fraud in silk. He wrapped deception in prestige. And he convinced thousands of people that their futures were safer in his hands than in ordinary banks. But in the end, the billionaire was fake. The empire was hollow. And the cost was real. Very real. Because when financial predators steal from the vulnerable, they don't just take money. They take years. They take peace. They take dignity. And sometimes, they take the future itself. If you want more true crime stories about power, deception, and the darkest crimes hidden behind success, subscribe now. Because the